Hello, good morning. You're watching Breakfast with Charlie State and Naga Manchetti.
Time now is 8:32. Thousands of Scottish women who were forced to give up their babies for adoption because they were unmarried have received an official government apology.
In one of her last acts as First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon said the mothers had been living through a nightmare of shame and grief. Our correspondent, Duncan Kennedy, has followed the women's campaign for recognition and an apology.
Elspeth, Lisa, Sharon. Just some of the 60,000 women in Scotland forced to give up their newborn babies for adoption. With them too is Jano, at peace now, but 40 years ago, as a young, unmarried, pregnant woman, it was very different.
The worst of it was the experience when I went to hospital.
Like those thousands of other young women from the 50s, 60s and 70s, Jano was shunned by everyone around her, including staff at the NHS hospital she went to give birth in.
The circumstances of the delivery were brutal. The way I was treated when I arrived in hospital was brutal. And it was shocking to me to be treated like that in the NHS.
Both during and after delivery, she was given no pain relief, and despite her screams, had stitches without anaesthetic. She was then left abandoned, alone in a room.
I had a very thin covering over it. My memory thinks it's a sheet, but I'm not even sure if it was a sheet or paper. And it was very cold. I was very, very cold. And I was left there for 4 hours.
You used a word when you were giving birth to describe your experience. What was that?
I used the word torture. You know, it was painful, but it wasn't the pain that was the issue. It was that you know someone is hurting you. They know that they're hurting you, and they don't care. And they're doing what they're doing, and almost deliberately hurting you. I think that's torture.
Do you think he did that because you were unmarried?
I do. I think the question that's difficult for us to fathom is, how do good people, and most people are good people, how do good people get persuaded in their jobs to do things like that?
When was the first time you saw your baby son?
I never saw my baby as a baby. I saw my son when he was a grown man, 31 years old.
Did you give your baby away?
I did not.
The horror of what happened to these women is almost impossible to comprehend.
Jano and others campaigned for years to get an apology for the treatment they received and the pressure they were put under to hand over their babies. And now, finally, they've been given one.
To the mothers who had their babies taken away from them, to the sons and the daughters who were separated from their parents, to the fathers who were denied their rights, and to the families who have lived with the legacy. For the decades of pain that you have suffered, I offer today a sincere, heartfelt, and unreserved apology. We are sorry.
The power of one word.
We've had the apology.
Yes.
You got there in the end.
Yes.
What does it mean?
It means, as we said, I've no longer got to use that phrase that I gave up my baby for adoption, because the responsibility has passed now. You know, the shame has been transferred to the government. The power has been transferred back to us.
You went on to have other children and you were reunited with your son. What did this whole experience of forced adoption do to you?
We missed first words, first steps, going to school, all those lovely landmarks that parents have. But what I really grieve about was not being there for my son when things were difficult, not being there to pick up the pieces of that and hold him back up. That's the bit that there's a prolonged grief about and a prolonged loss of, that I couldn't do better.
So that was Duncan Kennedy reporting for us. And thank you so much to all those people who are honest and so open about the trauma they've been going through for such a long time. With us now, Dr. Michael Lambert, who researches the history of the NHS. I saw you nodding as you were listening to that very personal testimony. And there was the line, I think, that I saw you reacting to when the question was asked is, how do good people do that? And it's one of those fundamentals. You can look at the statistics and we can talk about, what did happen. Are you any clearer after all the work you've done as to how there was a kind of a mindset that was so at odds with what you would think to be reasonable?
I think it's mainly to do with the taken for granted assumptions of the time, in a sense that the expectations of society about marriage, about raising a family, about the norms and ideals that went with that were very deeply embedded. But I think the ultimate reason why I was nodding along and found it to resonate so strongly was because, in essence, there was a government-led, funded, sponsored, directed series of policies that cascaded down right from the very top all the way through different government organisations to that very point, those moments where you would have an official interacting with a mother and leaving them with no option but to have their child taken away from them.
And Jano made very clear kind of what she had been through when talking to Duncan. What is the significance of this apology from the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon? And there is a difference between that apology from the Scottish Government and the government representing England and Wales.
I think it's enormous in so many levels and so many degrees that, in a sense, that the First Minister's statement was an apology. It was very heartfelt, it was very profound, and that very much came across in her speaking. But I think what's important is she's apologised and recognised that injustice, that wrong for everybody involved. So it's the birth mothers, it's the adopted adults, it's the fathers, it's the families and communities that were torn apart as a result of that. And she's been very conscious in how she's sculpted her statement in a way that it draws on an apology almost 9 years ago to the day in Australia when Julia Gillard apologised in 2013 for Australia in a similar set of circumstances, a similar set of relations. And the way that this is not just a national issue within Scotland and England, but also an international one with large changes across time, I think what's significant is that Nicola Sturgeon has set the benchmark, and she stood up and recognised and accepted yesterday what she said. She was morally responsible in her role as First Minister in taking the government forward.
But the British government has apologised for society's behaviour at that time.
The British government's response to the Joint Committee on Human Rights inquiry into the forced adoption of unmarried mothers, it says sorry 15 or 16 times, the word in the report, sorry, but at no point in that report do they apologise for their involvement.
Michael, what does history tell us, and that's your area, of an official apology and what you can see what difference it makes to an individual? What about the future, as in what is the significance in terms of policy, in terms of making sure that anything like that can't happen again?
I think that's ultimately a political decision about learning from the past, about taking on board ultimately the lived experience of everybody involved, about the harm, about the injustice, about the hardships and difficulties that are being endured, and feeding those forward into policies and breaking away perhaps from the strictures, the constraints that really made it taken for granted the forcible adoption.
I suppose in a way it's that if people don't hear a profound sorry, the assumption is that actually kind of things were acceptable.
I agree.
Is it that straightforward?
I think it's that straightforward. I think the weight of opinion and direction of travel means that the government's unwillingness to issue an apology, it's a matter of inevitability. They will have to give one at some stage because the weight of historical evidence, the weight of lived experience and the opinion of those involved signifies the deep involvement of the government to both recognise this moment in time and learn from history as a result.
Dr. Michael Lambert, it's been really interesting talking to you. Thank you so much for your time with us on The Sofa.
Thank you very much.
Time now is